Let's look at some of the more structural elements of HTML now. I'll start off with tables, which are perhaps a little bit surprising as the starting point because forms and links, which are the subjects of the next two lectures, are the more often used elements, and tables perhaps more advanced. The use is for organizing complex data, as you're probably aware of, and that's perhaps the reason why I want to mention those first, because I want to get something out of the way right up front. If you look at some of the earlier work on HTML and layouts of HTML, then tables were used as a way of laying out elements on a page, and that's a bad thing to do. There are all sorts of issues with that, and in particular when we're looking at providing a clear semantics to the content of our web page, then using a table to structure it is completely bizarre. It puts a layer of indirection on top of the content of your document. Use style sheets for laying out elements, and in the HTML you provide, as I've said many times, markup to describe the content of your document. And having got that out of the way, then tables are an extremely useful way of providing a way of presenting complex data, and it's for that purpose and that purpose alone that I'm presenting tables in this lecture. So let's look at a proper table. I've called it a proper table because this is about presenting data. So we've got a simple table whose purpose is to provide a list of plants, what nurseries promise of them, and the problems with them. So this is a collection of data about plants which nurseries should not ought to be selling to the public because of various reasons. We've got the basic structure here of a table. The tags table to mark the table as an element indicates, as it says there, content to be arranged in a tabular fashion. So that's the top level, the root of the root element of a table, and then below that we've got a table row. And in this particular case, we're just going to give names to the columns, but I'm not distinguishing that row in any way at this stage. I'll do that later on. So this is a generic table row, and within that we've got table cells. And again, to emphasize, the table cells contain content. That's the raw data that needs to be structured in the table. Don't use blank table cells to lay out the table. Do the layout with style sheets. And again, any CSS course will show you how to lay out tables properly. It's not a difficult thing to do, and there's all sorts of possibilities there. Do the layout in the style sheet, and for reasons which we'll go into a little bit in the next chapter of this course and in the follow-up course on style sheets, that is the right thing to do. So here we've got three kinds of elements: the table, which is identifying structured data, a table row, and table cells, three table cells in this particular case. Next thing we want to do is to put some data in there. So let's add some content into the table. I've put two additional rows in here with three cells each, of course, corresponding to the respective elements. So again, we've got some relatively lightweight presentation of the data, because I'm not distinguishing the header at this stage from the content cells. So if we look at that now in a proper document, so I've just shown you the focus on the table itself, and in the remainder of this lecture I'm just going to focus on the table, but don't forget that needs to be inserted in a valid HTML document using the template which we saw before. So pop that table into a proper document and render it in a browser, and this is what I get. So most of the browsers will show something like this, minimal layout on it, no styling at all, but at least I've got a tabular structure. So the titles there in the browser menu bar, and I've got rows and columns as I've asked for, but no distinction between the first row, which is the header row, and the remainder of the data. So let's tidy that up a little bit more, and I'm going to do two things now. The first thing I'm going to do is to change the names of the elements of the first row to table heading elements. So that's the only change to that particular row. That's a table row, but instead of having cells, I've got table heading elements. So you'll see the three elements there have got a different tag associated with them. And then secondly, I'm going to put a caption on the table. And again, in your style sheet you can arrange how that's done, but there is a default styling of a default layout of that. There's no special styling, which we'll see here. So again, the header row now is emboldened, and the caption is put by convention at the top of the table. So a little bit more content there, explaining what the table's about and highlighting the table header. We can do a little bit more than that. For accessibility purposes, we can put in a summary. There's a certain amount of there's some unclarity or lack of clarity about that summary attribute in HTML5. This is an HTML4 attribute, and it's not entirely clear whether browsers are required to support this in HTML5, but it is an extremely useful attribute to put. As we'll see in a moment, it doesn't actually make any change to the layout of the table itself, but it does provide some useful metadata for a screen reader, so that the screen reader can introduce the content of the table for any visually impaired reader of the website. So there's certainly no harm in putting that in. It does seem to be accepted by current browsers, and most current screen readers will interpret that correctly. So it is a useful thing to include still. The other things, if you glance at this, you'll see is that I've put a little bit more structure into the table. So instead of just having the table head elements, I've identified the head of the table as a section in itself, and the table body as well as a separate section. And in addition, I've got scoping on there, so the headings are, as you see in the head of the table, scoped to columns, and then I've designated a heading element for each row which is scoped to the row. So a little bit more structure in there, and this now by default renders in this style. So we've got highlighted rows with the first element in each row highlighted as a heading element for each row and the columns as before. So those are the main differences by default, but of course by identifying those distinct semantic elements in terms of the head of the table and the body of the table, then that gives you a lot more scope when it comes to styling the document. That is almost complete, but I want to add just one final thing. I'm going to put in a footer there. I'm not going to show, for simplicity, I'm not going to show the whole structure of the table. So I've just popped in underneath the header element a footer element, and again you'll see that is interpreted as a footer by all the browsers. So the fact that I've put it underneath a header isn't important. The browser is going to place that under the foot, at the foot of the table. I've just got a date timestamp there, machine readable date timestamp in there, referring back to the previous lecture, and I've indicated in an attribute of the element that I want to span it across all three elements. So this is my final cut at the table for the moment. There's more you can do at that. And of course, now I've got a nice clear semantic markup of my table, then when it comes to styling this, I've got all sorts of flexibility there in terms of identifying the key semantic elements of the table and styling those appropriately so that the table, when it is rendered in a browser, is nicely laid out and presented. So that's the very basics of tables. That still gets you a long way. There's more on the web, of course. Robert Johansson's article is an excellent place to start, and you'll see much of the content that I've presented here is covered in that lecture, plus a little bit more to give you some more pointers as to how to style up tables. Next, we're going to have a look at forms, and that's a key part of the modern web, so that will be a slightly longer lecture.